Nothing breaks a father's heart quite like watching his child lose hope. When Eli Harper lost his job and had to move his teenage daughter back to his late father's rundown farm, he saw that familiar look of disappointment in her eyes, the same look his own father had carried for years. Everyone said the old farmland was worthless. His late wife's family mocked the rickety treehouse his grandfather had built decades ago. His neighbors whispered that he was a failure, just like his father before him. Even his daughter Maya begged him to sell everything and move somewhere with real opportunities. But Eli believed there was something special about this land, something worth fighting for. One stormy night, while fixing the treehouse's broken floor, his hammer crashed through what looked like solid wood. Hidden underneath was an old lockbox filled with papers, mining deeds, maps, and documents all bearing the Harper family name. Those papers proved the worthless land was sitting on a mining claim worth over $175 million. Now everyone who had mocked the Harper family suddenly wanted a piece of their fortune. But would Eli be strong enough to protect what was rightfully his? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Eli Harper had been a different man entirely. He'd worn tailored suits to his corner office on the 32nd floor of a gleaming downtown tower, where he managed procurement contracts for a multinational corporation. His business cards read Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions, and his colleagues respected his quiet competence and steady judgment. He'd built what most people would call a successful life. Suburban home with a 3-car garage, retirement account that promised security, and enough stability to send his daughter Maya to any college she chose. That life had crumbled in less than a week. The corporate restructuring came without warning. 23 years with the company, and Eli learned about his termination in an email marked high priority. The severance package was generous enough, but in an economy where experienced executives were competing with candidates half their age for positions that paid half what they were worth, generous didn't last long. The suburban house, with its mortgage payments designed for a 6-figure salary, became an anchor, dragging him toward financial ruin. Maya had been 16 when everything fell apart, old enough to understand that her father's carefully constructed world was dissolving, but too young to hide her resentment about what it meant for her own future. The college acceptance letter from Northwestern, her dream school, still sat on her bedroom dresser like a monument to opportunities that might slip away. Eli caught her staring at it sometimes, with an expression that reminded him painfully of his own father's face during the lean years. When pride wrestled with practicality and usually lost, the decision to move back to his father's farm hadn't been about nostalgia or returning to his roots. It had been about survival. The property in Millbrook County represented the only asset Eli owned outright, inherited when his father passed 5 years earlier. He'd never intended to live there again. The farmhouse had been empty since his father's death, slowly surrendering to time and weather, but it offered something his city life no longer could. A roof over their heads without a mortgage payment bleeding him dry each month. Maya had fought the move with the fierce intensity that only teenagers could muster. She'd accused him of giving up, of running away from their problems instead of solving them. Her words had cut deep because they carried an uncomfortable echo of truth. But what choice did he have? The job market had made it clear that 52 was too old to start over in corporate America, and too young to accept defeat gracefully. The Harper family farm sprawled across 87 acres of rolling hills and weathered pasture land, bordered by a creek that ran clear and cold even in the driest summers. It had been beautiful once, when Eli's grandfather worked the land with the patient determination of a man who understood that the earth rewarded those who listened to its rhythms. But that was decades ago, before economic pressures and family tensions had fractured the Harper legacy into something that looked more like failure than tradition. Eli's father had never possessed his own father's gift for farming. He'd struggled for years to make the land profitable, borrowing against future harvests that never quite materialized. Watching neighboring farms get bought up by agribusiness corporations that could afford the machinery and chemicals that modern farming demanded. The weight of disappointing his father's expectations had settled into the older man's shoulders like a physical burden, visible in the way he'd walk the property lines with his head down, as if apologizing to the soil for his inadequacy. The farmhouse itself told the story of those struggling years. What had once been a proud two-story home with wraparound porches and hand-carved woodwork now sagged under the accumulated weight of deferred maintenance. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips that fluttered in the wind like prayer flags. The front steps had developed a dangerous lean, and several windows were cracked with tape holding the pieces together. Inside, the rooms felt hollow and cold, filled with the musty smell of a house that had been empty too long. But it was the tree house that drew the most criticism from anyone who visited the property built by Eli's grandfather. Sometime in the 1940s, it perched in the massive branches of a white oak that had to be at least 200 years old. The tree itself was magnificent, 60 feet tall, with a trunk so wide that 3 adults holding hands couldn't encircle it. But the structure nestled in its branches looked like something a child might have cobbled together from scrap lumber and wishful thinking. Weathered boards hung at odd angles, held together by nails that had worked loose over the decades. The roof sagged dangerously, and the rope ladder that provided access had rotted through in several places. To most people who saw it, the tree house looked like exactly what Maya called it, a monument to poor craftsmanship and misguided priorities. Eli's late wife, Catherine, had been particularly vocal about her disdain for the structure. She'd grown up in the Whitmore family, where success was measured in stock portfolios and country club memberships, and she'd never understood why the Harper men seemed drawn to projects that produced more sentiment than value. Catherine's family had made their feelings about the Harper legacy abundantly clear during the years of Eli's marriage. Richard Whitmore, Catherine's father, was a retired bank president who spoke about financial responsibility with the authority of someone who'd never missed a mortgage payment. He'd offered multiple times to help Eli sell the farm and invest the proceeds in something sensible, mutual funds or municipal bonds that would provide steady returns, without the headache of maintaining rural property. "That old place is nothing but a money pit," Richard would say during family dinners, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a slow student. "Every year you hold on to it, you're throwing away money on property taxes and maintenance for land that's never going to appreciate. Cut your losses and move on." Catherine's brother David had been even more direct, a real estate attorney who specialized in commercial development. He'd researched the property values in Millbrook County and pronounced the Harper farm economically unviable. The soil wasn't suitable for large-scale agriculture, the infrastructure was decades out of date, and the location was too remote to attract suburban development. In David's professional opinion, the highest and best use of the property was to sell it to one of the agribusiness corporations that were consolidating smaller farms throughout the region. The Whitmore family's criticism had stung because it carried the weight of evidence. They could point to bank statements and market analyses that supported their arguments about fiscal responsibility and practical decision-making. They'd built their wealth through careful planning and rational choices, not through sentimental attachments to property that generated more expenses than income. But Eli had never been able to bring himself to sell. Something about the land called to him in ways he couldn't articulate. The way morning mist rose from the creek in the early hours, the sound of wind moving through the oak tree's ancient branches, the sense of continuity that connected him to generations of Harper men who'd walked these same hills and worked this same soil. Now, standing in the farmhouse kitchen with its chipped linoleum floors and outdated appliances, Eli wondered if the Whitmores had been right all along. Maybe holding on to the farm had been about pride rather than wisdom, sentiment rather than sense. Maybe he'd dragged his daughter into his own romantic fantasy about rural life and family legacy, when what she needed was practical support for the future she'd planned. Maya certainly seemed to think so. She'd spent their first week on the farm, cataloging everything that was wrong with their new living situation. From the unreliable internet connection that made it difficult to stay in touch with her friends, to the 40-minute drive to the nearest decent restaurant. She'd made it clear that she viewed the move as temporary, a brief detour, before they got back to their real lives in places where people understood the value of career, advancement and educational opportunities. The closest neighbor was Sarah Chen, a woman about Eli's age, who lived alone in a renovated farmhouse about a mile down the county road. She'd stopped by during their second week with a casserole and the kind of practical advice that only came from experience with rural living, which propane company offered the best service, where to get the well water tested, how to negotiate with the county about road maintenance. She'd been friendly without being intrusive, offering help without making it feel like charity. Sarah worked as a consulting geologist, traveling to mining sites and environmental assessments throughout the region. She'd mentioned during their conversation that she'd chosen rural life deliberately after years of city living, drawn by the peace and the connection to the land that urban environments couldn't provide. Eli had found himself envious of her certainty about the choice she'd made. She seemed comfortable with herself in a way that he couldn't quite manage, secure in decisions that others might question. The local community had received the Harper family's return with the polite reserve that small towns typically showed toward outsiders, even outsiders who'd grown up there. Eli had been gone for over 20 years, long enough to lose his place in the social networks that defined rural relationships. People were friendly enough at the grocery store or the gas station, but he could sense the underlying skepticism about his motives for coming back. Some of that skepticism was justified. Eli wasn't entirely sure himself why he'd chosen to stay rather than sell the property and use the proceeds to start over somewhere else. The rational choice would have been to liquidate his inheritance and use the money to support Maya's education while he searched for employment in a market where his skills were valued. Instead, he'd chosen to retreat to a place where success was measured by standards he wasn't sure he understood anymore. But something about the land felt like sanctuary, even in its current state of neglect. Walking the property lines in the early morning hours, before Maya woke up and the weight of practical concerns settled back onto his shoulders, Eli could imagine the conversations he might have had with his grandfather if time and circumstances had been different. He could envision the farm as it might have been, productive and prosperous, supporting a family through honest work and careful stewardship. The treehouse figured prominently in those imagined conversations. Despite its ramshackle appearance, the structure possessed a solid foundation that suggested his grandfather had built it to last. The main platform was constructed from oak planks that had weathered to a silver-gray patina but remained structurally sound. The frame was anchored to the tree's massive trunk with hardware that showed rust but no signs of failure. Whatever his grandfather's intentions had been, he'd clearly invested significant time and skill in creating something meant to endure. Maya had climbed up to explore the treehouse during their first week on the farm, more out of boredom than curiosity. She'd reported that the interior was gross but not completely awful, filled with old magazines, rusty tools, and what looked like camping equipment from several decades past. The roof leaked in 2 places, and the wooden floor felt spongy in spots where moisture had caused rot. But the basic structure remained intact. "It's like a time capsule up there," she told Eli over dinner that night. "Everything's covered in dust and spider webs, but you can tell somebody spent a lot of time in that place. There's even an old radio that might still work if you could find batteries for it." Eli had made a mental note to climb up and assess the treehouse himself. But the daily challenges of settling into rural life had kept him busy with more pressing concerns. The farmhouse needed extensive repairs before winter. The well pump was making concerning noises, and he was still learning to navigate the bureaucratic requirements of rural property ownership, from septic system inspections to agricultural exemptions for property taxes. But late at night, lying in his childhood bedroom with its slanted ceiling and wallpaper that hadn't been changed since the 1980s, Eli found himself thinking about the treehouse and what it might represent. His grandfather had built it during the years when the farm was prosperous, when the Harper name meant something in Millbrook County. Maybe restoring it could be a way of reconnecting with that legacy, of showing Maya that their family's history included more than just the failures that had driven them from the city. The project would give them something to work on together, a shared goal that might help bridge the growing distance between them. And perhaps, in the process of bringing the treehouse back to life, they might discover something valuable about themselves and their capacity for building rather than just surviving. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening in late September, rolling across the hills with the kind of fury that reminded people why their grandparents had built root cellars and kept emergency supplies. Eli watched it approach from the farmhouse kitchen window, noting the way the wind bent the smaller trees almost horizontal and sent loose debris tumbling across the pasture like tumbleweeds. Maya was upstairs doing homework, or at least pretending to. The weak internet signal made it difficult to tell whether she was actually researching her history project or just staring at a loading screen with increasing frustration. The power had flickered twice already, and Eli knew it was only a matter of time before they lost electricity entirely. He'd learned enough about rural living to keep flashlights charged and candles ready when the first real crack of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by a lightning flash that turned the kitchen window white. Eli realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary autumn storm. The wind was picking up velocity with each gust, and he could hear something metallic banging against the barn with increasing urgency. He'd need to check the outbuildings once the worst of it passed, make sure nothing important had been damaged or blown away. The power went out during the third lightning strike, plunging the house into the kind of darkness that only existed in places without streetlights or neighbors' windows. Eli fumbled for the flashlight he'd left on the counter, clicking it on just as Maya's voice drifted down from upstairs. "Dad, my laptop just died and my phone's almost dead too. Please tell me you have some way to charge things." "There's a gas generator in the barn," Eli called back, "but I'm not going out there until this passes. We'll manage with flashlights for a few hours." He heard Maya's dramatic sigh, even over the sound of rain hammering against the roof. She'd been increasingly frustrated with what she called the pioneer lifestyle they'd been forced to adopt, and a power outage during homework time wasn't going to improve her mood. But there wasn't much either of them could do, except wait for the storm to exhaust itself. It was during a brief lull in the thunder that Eli heard the sound that changed everything, a sharp crack followed by a prolonged groan, like old wood giving up its grip on life. The noise seemed to come from the direction of the oak tree, and Eli's first thought was that they'd lost one of the massive limbs that held the treehouse. He'd been planning to inspect the structure for weeks, but other priorities had kept pushing the project further down his list. What was that? Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway, flashlight in hand, and concern replacing her earlier irritation. "Sounded like it came from the oak tree," Eli said, moving toward the window, even though the darkness outside made it impossible to see anything useful. "Probably just a branch coming down. We'll check it out in the morning." But the sound nagged at him for the rest of the evening. The treehouse had already been in questionable condition. If the storm had damaged it further, the whole structure might become too dangerous to salvage. He'd been looking forward to the restoration project as something he and Maya could work on together, a way to connect with his grandfather's legacy while building something meaningful for their own future. By morning, the storm had moved on, leaving behind the crystalline air and brilliant sunshine that often followed violent weather. Eli woke early, eager to assess whatever damage the night had brought. He made coffee on the gas stove, another rural skill he was gradually mastering, and headed outside while Maya was still sleeping. The farmyard was littered with branches and debris, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned up with a few hours of work. The barn had lost a section of tin roofing, but the building itself remained structurally sound. It wasn't until Eli walked around to the back of the oak tree that he saw what the storm had done to the treehouse. The damage was more extensive than he'd expected, but also strangely selective. One corner of the platform had partially collapsed, where a large branch had fallen across it, but the main structure remained intact. What caught Eli's attention, though, was the way the floorboards had been torn up by the falling branch, exposing what looked like empty space beneath the platform. Curious. Eli climbed the rope ladder, testing each rung carefully before trusting it with his full weight. The interior of the treehouse was exactly as Maya had described it, dusty, filled with old camping gear and magazines, but basically sound. The fallen branch had crashed through the roof in the northeast corner, and the impact had pulled up several floorboards, revealing what appeared to be a hollow space underneath the main platform. Eli knelt beside the damaged section and shined his flashlight into the gap. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There was definitely a hidden compartment beneath the treehouse floor, and something metallic gleamed in the light, something that had been deliberately concealed and protected from the weather. Working carefully to avoid further damage to the weakened floor, Eli managed to pry up several more boards. The hidden space was larger than he'd initially thought, roughly 3 feet square and about 18 inches deep. And sitting in the center of the compartment, wrapped in what looked like an old tarp, was a metal box about the size of a large briefcase. Eli's hands shook slightly as he lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than expected, and he could hear objects shifting inside when he moved it. The metal was corroded, but intact, and there was a simple latch closure that opened with some effort. Whatever his grandfather had hidden here, he'd taken care to protect it from moisture and time. The box contained papers, lots of them, carefully organized and wrapped in oiled cloth bundles. There were maps, hand-drawn in fading ink but still legible, legal documents with official seals and signatures. What looked like correspondence, written in his grandfather's careful handwriting. And underneath everything else, a leather-bound ledger with Harper Mining Claim 1923 written on the cover in the same precise script. Eli sat back on his heels, staring at the collection of documents spread around him in the filtered sunlight that came through the oak tree's leaves. His grandfather had been a farmer, not a miner. The Harper family had never been involved in any kind of mining operation, as far as Eli knew. His father had certainly never mentioned anything about mineral rights or mining claims, but the evidence was right there in his hands. Official documents that clearly established some kind of mining claim associated with the Harper property. The maps showed the farm's boundaries, but with additional markings that indicated specific locations for what the legend identified as survey stakes and mineral deposits. The dates on the documents went back to the early 1920s, which meant his grandfather had been keeping this secret for over 70 years. Maya's voice from below startled him out of his examination of the papers. "Dad, what are you doing up there? I heard all this banging around." "Come up here," Eli called down, his voice tight with excitement and confusion. "But be careful on the ladder. I found something you need to see." Maya climbed up with the casual agility of 16-year-old, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to genuine amazement when she saw the documents spread across the treehouse floor. "What is all this stuff?" she asked, kneeling beside him and picking up one of the maps. "These look really old." "They are old," Eli said, handling one of the legal documents with the reverence due to something that might be extremely valuable. "And if I'm reading these correctly, your great-grandfather owned a mining claim on this property. A mining claim that nobody in the family knew about, Maya examined the map more closely, tracing the property boundaries with her finger. Mining for what? Eli found the answer in the ledger, written in his grandfather's methodical handwriting. Preliminary survey confirms significant deposits of rare earth minerals, including lithium and cobalt, throughout the Harper property. Estimated value based on 1923 market prices, $47,000. Total recoverable reserves potentially much higher pending full geological survey. He showed Maya the entry, watching her eyes widen as she processed the implications. "Dad," she said slowly, "rare earth minerals are worth a fortune now. Like people fight wars over lithium deposits. If there's really that much under our land..." Eli nodded, feeling a strange combination of excitement and apprehension settling in his chest. His grandfather hadn't been the failure everyone thought. He'd been sitting on a potential fortune, but for reasons that were still unclear, he'd chosen to keep it secret. And now that secret had been passed down to a family that desperately needed exactly this kind of miracle. But as Eli gathered the precious documents back into their protective wrappings, one thought kept nagging at him. If the mining claim was real and potentially valuable, why had his grandfather hidden it instead of developing it? And more importantly, who else might know about the Harper family's buried treasure? Eli spent the next 3 days researching everything he could find about mining law, mineral rights, and the current market value of rare earth elements. The farmhouse's unreliable internet connection made the process frustratingly slow. But gradually he began to piece together a picture that made his grandfather's secrecy both understandable and troubling. Rare earth minerals had indeed become extraordinarily valuable, essential components in everything from smartphones to electric car, batteries to military equipment. Lithium alone was trading at prices that would have been unimaginable in his grandfather's time, and cobalt deposits were considered strategic resources by governments around the world. If the 1923 geological survey was even remotely accurate, the Harper property could be worth tens of millions of dollars. But the more Eli learned about modern mining operations, the more he understood why his grandfather might have chosen to keep the claim secret. Large-scale mineral extraction wasn't the small, family-operated enterprise it had been in the 1920s. Today's mining companies were multinational corporations, with the resources to fight lengthy legal battles and the political influence to override local opposition. They could transform the Harper farm from a peaceful rural property into an industrial site that would destroy everything his family had worked to preserve. Maya had thrown herself into the research with an enthusiasm that surprised Eli. Her resentment about leaving the city seemed to evaporate once she realized they might be sitting on a treasure that could solve all their financial problems and more. She'd taken over the project of digitizing and organizing the documents they'd found, creating spreadsheets and maps that helped them understand the scope of what they'd discovered. "Look at this," she said on Thursday evening, spreading out one of the hand-drawn maps on the kitchen table. Great-grandfather marked at least 12 different locations where he found mineral deposits. And these aren't just random spots. There's a pattern here, like he was following some kind of geological formation. Eli studied the map, noting the careful notations in his grandfather's handwriting. Each marked location included detailed descriptions of soil composition, elevation, and proximity to water sources. This wasn't the work of an amateur treasure hunter. It was a systematic geological survey conducted by someone who understood what he was looking for. He must have spent years mapping all of this, Eli said. The question is, why didn't he ever file the proper claims or try to develop the deposits? The answer to that question became clearer when Maya found additional documents hidden in a second compartment they'd discovered while examining the treehouse more thoroughly. These papers told a different story, one of family conflict and legal complications that had prevented his grandfather from moving forward with his mining plans. "Dad, you need to read this," Maya said, handing him a letter dated 1925 and written in his grandfather's increasingly agitated handwriting. "It's addressed to someone named J.B. Morrison, and it's not friendly. The letter made it clear that his grandfather had indeed tried to develop the mining claim, but had run into opposition from local interests who wanted to prevent any industrial development in the area. J.B. Morrison appeared to be a local businessman who had been buying up mineral rights throughout the county, and he'd made several attempts to acquire the Harper property through both legal and extra-legal means. "I will not be intimidated into selling my family's land to line your pockets," the letter read. "The Harper claim is legally filed and properly documented, and no amount of political pressure or legal maneuvering will change that fact. If you continue to harass my family or interfere with my surveying activities, I will take this matter to the federal authorities." But the most revealing document was a journal entry from later that same year. Written in his grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting, J.B. Morrison's threats have escalated beyond what I can ignore. He's made it clear that developing the mining claim will bring consequences for my family that I'm not prepared to face. For now, I'm hiding the documents and suspending all mining activities. Perhaps future generations will be in a better position to pursue what is rightfully theirs. The land will keep its secrets until the Harper family is strong enough to protect them. Eli set the letter down with a heavy feeling in his chest. His grandfather hadn't been weak or indecisive. He'd been protecting his family from forces that were bigger and more dangerous than he could handle alone. The mining claim hadn't been developed because pursuing it would have put his children and grandchildren at risk. But that was nearly a century ago. Surely the local power dynamics had changed enough that the Harper family could pursue their legal rights without facing the kind of intimidation his grandfather had encountered. That optimistic assumption lasted until Friday afternoon, when Eli received an unexpected visit from David Whitmore, Catherine's brother and the family's real estate attorney. David arrived in his spotless BMW sedan, wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that were designed to look relaxed while costing more than most people's monthly salary. He'd always made Eli feel slightly uncomfortable, too polished, too confident, too ready with legal solutions for problems that required more nuanced approaches. "I heard you'd moved back to the old place," David said, accepting Eli's offer of coffee but declining to sit down at the kitchen table. "I wanted to check in, see how you're settling in. This must be a difficult transition for Maya." Eli wondered who had told David about their living situation and why Catherine's brother would drive 40 minutes from town just to check on their well-being. The Whitmore family had never shown much interest in maintaining relationships after Catherine's death, and David's sudden concern felt more professional than personal. "We're managing fine," Eli said carefully. "It's an adjustment, but Maya's handling it better than I expected," David nodded. But his attention seemed to be focused on examining the farmhouse interior with the calculating eye of someone assessing property values. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out toward the oak tree, where the damaged treehouse was clearly visible. "I notice you've been doing some work on that old eyesore," David said. "Planning to tear it down? That would probably help with property values if you decide to sell." Something in David's tone set off alarm bells in Eli's mind. How did he know about the treehouse repairs? The work had been minimal so far, just securing the damaged sections and cleaning up the storm debris. Unless someone had been watching the property, there was no way David could have known about the recent activity. "Actually, I'm planning to restore it," Eli said, keeping his voice neutral. "It has sentimental value, and Maya's interested in the project." David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Eli caught a flash of something that looked like irritation before the polished smile returned. "Of course, I understand the emotional attachment," David said. "But from a practical standpoint, you might want to consider whether putting money into repairs is the best use of your resources. The whole property would be much more attractive to potential buyers without that structure cluttering up the landscape." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David making increasingly specific suggestions about how Eli could maximize the property's potential through strategic improvements and market timing. By the time Catherine's brother left, Eli was certain of two things. David Whitmore knew more about the Harper property than he was letting on, and his sudden interest in their welfare had nothing to do with family concern. Maya proved to be far better at interpreting the old survey maps than Eli had expected. Her generation's comfort with digital mapping tools and satellite imagery made it relatively easy for her to correlate her great-grandfather's hand-drawn sketches with the current landscape. By Saturday morning, she'd identified the approximate locations of 8 of the 12 survey stakes marked on the original documents. The tricky part is that some of these landmarks don't exist anymore, she explained, spreading printouts of satellite photos across the kitchen table alongside the vintage maps. This stream here changed course sometime in the last 50 years, and there used to be a barn where that grove of trees is now. But I think I can find at least half of the original markers if we're willing to do some hiking. Eli was more than willing. The physical activity would be good for both of them, and the shared project was already bringing them closer together than they'd been since before Catherine's death. Maya's earlier resentment about their rural exile was being replaced by genuine excitement about their treasure hunt. And for the first time in months, she seemed genuinely happy about something. They started with the closest marker, supposedly located about 200 yards northeast of the oak tree, near what the map identified as the lightning-split elm. The elm was gone, but its massive stump remained clearly visible in a small clearing beyond the pasture fence. Maya had calculated the bearing and distance from multiple reference points, and her math proved accurate. They found the original survey stake exactly where her research had predicted. The marker was a steel rod about 3 feet long, driven deep into the ground with only 6 inches visible above the surface. Time and weather had covered it with rust and overgrowth, but the stamped lettering was still legible. Harper Claim, 1923, USGS Survey. "This is it," Eli said, running his fingers over the corroded metal. "This proves the mining claim is real, officially filed and properly marked." Maya was already using her phone to take GPS coordinates and photos, building a digital record of their discoveries. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Eli found himself caught up in the excitement of validating his grandfather's century-old work. They spent the rest of the morning locating 3 more survey stakes, each one confirming the accuracy of the original maps and the legitimacy of the Harper mining claim. The markers formed a rough boundary around the most promising section of the property, nearly 40 acres of rolling hills and creek bottom that looked no different from any other part of the farm, but apparently contained deposits of some of the most valuable minerals on Earth. It was while they were hiking back toward the house that Eli first noticed the vehicle parked on the county road near their property line. A dark SUV with tinted windows, positioned where the occupants would have a clear view of the farmhouse and surrounding fields. The vehicle hadn't been there when they'd started their survey work, and something about its placement suggested surveillance rather than casual interest. "Maya," Eli said quietly, "don't look directly, but there's a car on the road that wasn't there before. Can you see it in your peripheral vision?" Maya nodded, her expression shifting from excitement to concern. "Should we be worried about that?" Before Eli could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then decided to answer. "Mr. Harper, this is Dale Morrison with Morrison Development Group. I understand you've recently moved back to your family's property, and I'd like to discuss a business opportunity that might interest you." The name Morrison triggered an immediate memory of the letters they'd found in the treehouse. J.B. Morrison had been the businessman who'd pressured his grandfather to sell the mining claim in the 1920s. This had to be a descendant, possibly a son or grandson, continuing the family interest in Harper land. "I'm not looking to sell," Eli said, watching the SUV on the road while he talked. "I understand that," Morrison replied smoothly, "but I think you might change your mind once you hear what I'm prepared to offer. Your property has some unique characteristics that make it particularly valuable for a development project I'm planning. Would it be possible for me to stop by this afternoon? I promise it will be worth your time. Eli's instincts told him to refuse, but his curiosity about the Morrison family's continuing interest in their land was stronger than his caution. I suppose that would be all right, but I should tell you up front that I'm not interested in selling. Of course not, Morrison said. I wouldn't expect you to make that kind of decision without understanding all your options. I'll be there around 2 o'clock if that works for you. The line went dead, and Eli noticed that the SUV on the road had disappeared. Either the timing was coincidental, or Morrison's people had been watching the property to determine the best moment for contact. Maya had been listening to his side of the conversation, and her expression reflected his own unease. Dad, this feels like the same thing that happened to great-grandfather. Different generation, same pressure to sell, Eli nodded, remembering the increasingly hostile tone of the letters his grandfather had written to the original J.B. Morrison. History appeared to be repeating itself, but this time the Harper family might be in a better position to resist. We need to be smart about this, Eli said. Before Morrison gets here, let's make sure all the documents are safely hidden. And I think it's time we talk to someone who understands both mining law and local politics. The obvious person to consult was Sarah Chen. As a consulting geologist, she would understand the technical aspects of mineral extraction, and her years of living in the area would give her insights into the local business community. More importantly, Eli trusted her in a way that he didn't trust anyone connected to the Whitmore family or their business associates. Sarah answered her phone on the second ring, and when Eli explained their situation, she agreed to come over immediately. Don't sign anything or make any commitments until I get there, she warned. If Morrison Development is involved, this is bigger than just your property. They've been acquiring land throughout this region for the past 5 years, and nobody's been able to figure out exactly what they're planning. By the time Sarah arrived, Eli and Maya had carefully re-hidden all the mining documents in the treehouse compartment, keeping only photocopies for reference. Sarah examined the copies with the professional interest of someone who understood their significance, whistling softly when she saw the geological survey data. Your grandfather was right about the mineral deposits, she said. This area sits on top of what geologists call the Millbrook Formation, a unique geological structure that's known to contain significant concentrations of rare earth elements. If these survey results are accurate, you're sitting on one of the most valuable, undeveloped mining claims in the region. Valuable enough to kill for? Maya asked, only half joking. Sarah's expression grew serious. Valuable enough to ruin lives over, certainly. The global demand for these minerals has increased exponentially in the past decade, and there are people who will do whatever it takes to control the supply. Your great-grandfather was smart to keep this secret, and you need to be very careful about who you trust with the information. At exactly 2 o'clock, Dale Morrison arrived in a silver Mercedes that looked like it had just rolled off a dealer's lot. He was younger than Eli had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of confident bearing that came from never having heard the word no applied to something he wanted. His handshake was firm, his smile was practiced, and his eyes missed nothing as he surveyed the farmhouse interior. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Morrison said, settling into the kitchen chair that Eli offered. "I realize this is probably the last thing you want to deal with while you're getting settled, but I think you'll find my proposal interesting." The Millbrook County Courthouse was a stately brick building that had been serving the community since 1887. Its high ceilings and marble floors speaking to an era when local government was conducted with more ceremony than efficiency. Eli and Maya arrived early on Monday morning, armed with photocopies of the mining documents and a list of questions that Sarah had helped them prepare. The key clerk in the mineral rights office was a woman named Betty Hawkins, who'd been working there for 37 years and seemed to know the history of every property in the county. When Eli explained what they were looking for, her eyebrows rose with genuine interest. Harper mining claim from 1923, she said, pulling out a massive leather-bound ledger that looked like it predated computers by several decades. I remember my predecessor mentioning something about that. Your grandfather filed one of the most detailed claims I've ever seen. Maps, geological surveys. The whole 9 yards. She flipped through pages of handwritten entries, stopping at a section marked with faded red ink. Here it is. Filed in March of 1923, properly witnessed and notarized. And look at this. He paid the maintenance fees every year until 1956. Then the payments stopped. Eli felt his heart sink. Does that mean the claim lapsed? Betty shook her head. Not necessarily. There was a grandfather clause in the mining law that allowed claims filed before 1930 to remain valid even without annual payments, as long as the original claimant maintained ownership of the surface rights. Since your family never sold the property, the mining claim should still be legally valid. Maya leaned forward with the intensity of a lawyer questioning a witness. Should be valid or is valid? That's where it gets complicated, Betty admitted. There have been challenges to the claim over the years, mostly from Morrison Development and their predecessors. They've argued that the lack of development activity invalidated the claim, but every time it's gone to court, the judges have ruled in favor of the Harper family. She pulled out a thick folder filled with legal documents. The most recent challenge was just 2 years ago. Morrison tried to have the claim declared abandoned, but the federal court ruled that as long as the Harper family maintained ownership of the surface rights, the mining claim remained valid. Eli studied the court documents, noting that David Whitmore's law firm had represented Morrison Development in their attempt to invalidate the Harper claim. Catherine's brother had been working against Eli's interest for years, probably hoping that the family would eventually sell the property without realizing what they were giving up. The implications were staggering. David had attended family dinners where he'd advised Eli to sell the worthless farm, all while knowing that the property contained mineral rights worth millions of dollars. The Whitmore family's persistent pressure to liquidate. The Harper inheritance hadn't been about financial responsibility. It had been about theft. Is there any way to estimate what the claim might be worth today? Maya asked. Betty consulted a computer screen that looked ancient by modern standards. Based on current market prices for rare earth minerals and the geological data in your grandfather's survey, I'd estimate the total value at somewhere between $100 and $200 million. Maybe more, depending on how much of the deposit is actually recoverable. Eli felt dizzy. $200 million. It was a sum that redefined everything. Their financial problems, Maya's college prospects, their entire future. But it also explained why so many people had been interested in acquiring the Harper property over the years. Their next stop was the office of Jennifer Walsh, a mining rights attorney that Sarah had recommended. Walsh specialized in representing small property owners against large corporations, and she'd been following the Morrison Development situation for several years. Morrison's been systematically acquiring mineral rights throughout this region. Walsh explained during their consultation, they've used every trick in the book. Legal challenges, political pressure, economic intimidation. Your family's claim is one of the last significant holdouts, and it's also one of the most valuable. She spread out a map showing Morrison's acquisitions over the past decade. Nearly every property surrounding the Harper farm had been purchased or leased by the development company, creating a patchwork of controlled territory that would allow them to conduct large-scale mining operations. Your property is right in the middle of their planned development zone, Walsh continued. Without access to your mineral rights, their entire project becomes significantly less profitable. That's why they've been fighting your family's claim for so long. Maya studied the map with the analytical intensity she usually reserved for her most challenging homework assignments. So they need our land to make their project work, but they can't just take it because great-grandfather filed the claim properly. Exactly, Walsh confirmed, but that doesn't mean they'll give up easily. Morrison has deep pockets and political connections that reach all the way to the state capital. They're prepared to fight this battle for as long as it takes. The attorney outlined several options for moving forward. They could begin the process of developing the mining claim themselves, which would require significant investment and technical expertise. They could lease the mineral rights to a reputable mining company, providing ongoing income without the operational headaches. Or they could sell the rights outright, realizing immediate value but giving up long-term benefits. What I wouldn't recommend, Walsh said firmly, is ignoring the situation and hoping it goes away. Morrison isn't going to stop pursuing your property, and their tactics tend to escalate over time. The sooner you establish your legal position and make your intentions clear, the better protected you'll be. On the drive home, Maya was unusually quiet, processing everything they'd learned. Finally, she spoke up with the kind of clarity that reminded Eli that his daughter was growing into a formidable young woman. "Dad, we can't just think about the money," she said. "If we let Morrison tear up the land for mining, we'll destroy everything the great-grandfather was trying to protect. But if we don't do something, they'll keep coming after us until they find a way to take it." Eli nodded, recognizing the same dilemma his grandfather had faced nearly a century earlier. The mining claim was simultaneously their greatest asset and their biggest vulnerability. Pursuing it would bring wealth beyond their imagination, but also conflict with forces that had been fighting for control of the region's mineral resources for generations. That evening, Sarah stopped by with a folder full of research about sustainable mining practices and environmental protection options. She'd been investigating ways to develop mineral resources without destroying the ecological integrity of the land, and her findings offered a potential middle path. "There are companies that specialize in selective extraction," she explained, showing them photographs of mining operations that looked more like precision surgery than industrial devastation. Instead of strip mining the entire area, they can target specific deposits and leave the rest of the landscape intact. "It's more expensive and takes longer, but it preserves the land for future generations." Maya brightened at the possibility. "So we could get the minerals out without turning the farm into a moonscape?" "It's possible," Sarah said, "but it would require working with the right partners and maintaining strict environmental controls. And it would definitely put you in conflict with Morrison's plans for large-scale development." As they discussed the various options, Eli found himself thinking about his grandfather's letters and the courage it had taken to stand up to the original J.B. Morrison. The Harper family had been protecting this land for 4 generations, and now it was his turn to make the decisions that would determine its future. But first, he needed to understand exactly what Dale Morrison was planning, and why the development company was so determined to acquire the Harper property. The meeting Morrison had requested was scheduled for the next afternoon, and Eli intended to be ready for whatever pressure tactics the man might employ. Dale Morrison's second visit began with a charm offensive that would have impressed a political campaign manager. He arrived with coffee from the best bakery in town, flowers for Maya, and a detailed presentation folder that made his previous casual approach look like amateur hour. But this time, Eli was prepared for manipulation tactics, and he'd asked Sarah to be present as both a witness and an expert consultant. "I realize our last conversation might have seemed a bit abrupt," Morrison began, settling into his chair with practiced ease. "I wanted to take more time to explain exactly what Morrison Development has in mind for this region, and how your family could benefit from being part of something truly transformational." He opened his presentation folder to reveal architectural renderings and economic projections that painted a picture of the area's potential future. Instead of industrial mining operations, Morrison was proposing what he called a sustainable development corridor, a combination of selective mineral extraction, ecotourism facilities, and high-end residential communities that would preserve the rural character while generating massive economic benefits. "We're not talking about strip mining or environmental destruction," Morrison explained, his tone carrying the sincerity of a man who'd rehearsed this speech many times. "This is about responsible development that benefits everyone: property owners, the local community, and the environment." Maya leaned forward to examine the renderings more closely. The proposed development looked impressive. Elegant buildings that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape, hiking trails and conservation areas. Even what appeared to be an educational center focused on geological and environmental sciences. "It looks nice," she admitted. "But how do you extract minerals without damaging the environment?" Morrison smiled as if he'd been hoping for exactly that question. "Modern mining technology has advanced far beyond what most people imagine. We use precision drilling and selective extraction techniques that can access mineral deposits without surface disruption. The vast majority of the land remains untouched, and in many cases, we can actually improve the ecological health of the area through careful restoration work." Sarah had been quietly studying the technical specifications in Morrison's presentation, and her expression grew increasingly skeptical as she read. When Morrison finished his pitch, she spoke up with the authority of someone who understood the real costs of mineral extraction. "Mr. Morrison, these drilling projections assume you'll be working with conventional mineral deposits in stable geological formations. But the Millbrook Formation is significantly more complex. The rare earth elements here are distributed through fractured bedrock and alluvial deposits that would require extensive excavation to access economically." Morrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure our geological team can work out any technical challenges. We've successfully completed similar projects in other regions." "Which regions?" Sarah pressed. "Because I've reviewed most of the major rare earth extraction projects in North America, and I haven't seen anything comparable to what you're describing here." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Morrison deflecting Sarah's technical questions while maintaining his focus on the economic benefits the Harper family would receive. His final offer was genuinely breathtaking: $15 million up front for the mineral rights, plus ongoing royalty payments that could potentially reach another $50 million over the life of the project. "That's more money than most families see in 10 generations, Morrison said, his tone suggesting that only a fool would reject such generosity. "And unlike developing the claim yourselves, this approach eliminates all the risk and regulatory headaches. You get immediate financial security, and we handle all the complexity." After Morrison left, the three of them sat in the kitchen reviewing everything they'd learned. The presentation had been professionally impressive, but Sarah's geological expertise had revealed fundamental flaws in Morrison's technical claims. "He's not being honest about the environmental impact," Sarah said bluntly. "The kind of extraction required for this formation would involve massive excavation, probably including open-pit mining. His precision drilling story is marketing fiction designed to make you feel better about destroying the land." Maya had been unusually quiet during Morrison's presentation, but now her anger was evident. "So he's basically offering to pay us to let him lie about what he's planning to do." "That's about the size of it," Eli agreed. "The question is, what do we do with that information?" The answer came from an unexpected source. While they were discussing their options, Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from her friend Jessica, whose family lived on the other side of the county. The message was brief but alarming. "My dad says to tell your dad that Morrison bought the Henderson place yesterday. Paid way over market value. People are starting to talk." Eli felt a chill of recognition. The Henderson property was one of the few remaining independent farms in the area, and its owner, Tom Henderson, had been publicly opposed to large-scale development projects. If Morrison had convinced Henderson to sell, it suggested that the pressure tactics were escalating beyond polite offers and professional presentations. Sarah pulled out her phone and made a quick call to a contact in the local real estate community. The conversation was brief, but her expression grew increasingly grim as she listened. "Morrison closed on 3 properties last week," she reported after hanging up. "The Henderson place, the old Kowalski farm, and the Brennan Ranch. All of them sold for significantly more than fair market value, and all of them had been refusing to sell for years." "What changed their minds?" Maya asked. "That's what worries me," Sarah replied. Tom Henderson told people just last month that he'd never sell to a development company. Something made him change his mind very quickly. The implications were clear. Morrison Development wasn't just making generous offers, they were applying pressure that convinced long-time holdouts to abandon their principles and sell their family properties. The Harper family's refusal to negotiate was probably seen as a direct challenge to Morrison's control of the region. That evening, while Maya was upstairs doing homework, Eli found himself sitting in the treehouse reading his grandfather's letters by flashlight. The parallels between past and present were becoming uncomfortably clear. The same family that had pressured his grandfather in the 1920s was now using similar tactics to acquire the Harper property, but with far more resources and sophistication. One letter in particular caught his attention, a final message that his grandfather had apparently written but never sent. Found among the papers but lacking an envelope or address. To whoever finds these documents, the Harper family has been guardians of this land for 3 generations, and we have tried to balance our responsibility to the future with our obligations to the present. The mineral wealth beneath this property could transform many lives, but only if it's developed with wisdom and restraint. Beware of those who see only the profits and ignore the costs. The earth remembers every wound we inflict upon it, and healing takes far longer than destruction. Reading those words, Eli felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy settling onto his shoulders. The old man hadn't hidden the mining claim out of fear or weakness. He'd been protecting it until his descendants were strong enough and wise enough to handle its power responsibly. But strength and wisdom might not be enough if Morrison Development was prepared to use the same tactics that had driven other families to sell their properties. Eli needed to understand exactly what kind of pressure the company was applying, and whether the Harper family was prepared to resist it. The answer to that question would determine not just their financial future, but the fate of the land that 4 generations of Harper men had called home. And as Eli climbed down from the treehouse and walked back toward the farmhouse where his daughter was preparing for her own future, he realized that the real battle was just beginning. Maya's discovery came at 3 in the morning on a Thursday, when most sensible people were asleep, but teenage insomniacs were pursuing research projects with the obsessive intensity that only adolescence could sustain. She'd been investigating Morrison Development's corporate structure and financial backing, following digital breadcrumbs through public records and business databases with the patience of a detective working a cold case. What she found changed everything. "Dad, wake up," she whispered, shaking Eli's shoulder with an urgency that immediately brought him to full alertness. "I found something about Morrison that you need to see right now." Eli followed his daughter downstairs to the kitchen, where her laptop was surrounded by printouts and handwritten notes that looked like the work product of an investigative journalist. Maya's eyes were bright with the kind of excitement that came from uncovering a conspiracy that was bigger and more complex than anyone had imagined. "I couldn't sleep, so I decided to dig deeper into Morrison Development's background," she began, pulling up a web page that showed corporate filings from the State Business Registry. "Look at this. The company was only incorporated 5 years ago, but they've acquired over 40 properties in this region. That kind of expansion requires serious money, more than a small development company should have access to." She clicked through several more pages, showing financial records and investment documents that painted a picture of Morrison Development's true scope. The company wasn't the regional operation that Dale Morrison had presented. It was backed by a consortium of international investors with ties to rare earth mining operations around the world. "But here's the really interesting part," Maya continued, pulling up a scanned document that looked like a legal contract. "I found this in the public records for Morrison's corporate filings. It's a partnership agreement between Morrison Development and Whitmore Holdings, LLC. Dad, your late wife's family has been working with Morrison for years." Eli stared at the document, feeling a sick recognition settle in his stomach. Whitmore Holdings was David Whitmore's investment company, which meant that Catherine's brother had been secretly partnering with the same people who were trying to acquire the Harper property. The family dinners where David had advised Eli to sell the worthless farm hadn't been about financial planning. They'd been about theft. Maya had more evidence. Corporate records showed that Whitmore Holdings had provided initial funding for Morrison Development's land acquisition program, and that David Whitmore served on Morrison's board of directors. The legal challenges to the Harper mining claim that had been filed over the years hadn't been Morrison's independent actions. They'd been coordinated attacks planned with inside knowledge of the Harper family's financial situation and legal vulnerabilities. "They've been playing a long game," Maya said, her voice tight with anger. "Uncle David knew about the mining claim all along. He's been trying to get us to sell the property so his development company could acquire the mineral rights without having to pay fair value. But the most damning discovery was a series of emails that Maya had found in a data breach report published by a cybersecurity firm. Morrison Development had apparently been hacked 6 months earlier, and some of their internal communications had been leaked online. Among those emails was a conversation between Dale Morrison and David Whitmore that laid out their strategy for acquiring the Harper property. "We can't wait for them to discover the claim on their own," Morrison had written. "If Harper realizes what he's sitting on, he'll never sell at the prices we're offering. We need to accelerate the pressure and make him an offer he can't refuse before he gets smart enough to consult an independent geologist." David's response was even more revealing. "Eli's financial situation is more desperate than he lets on. The unemployment benefits are running out, and Maya's college expenses will start hitting soon. If we can create enough economic pressure, he'll have to sell, regardless of sentiment about family land." The emails continued for several pages, detailing a coordinated campaign to pressure the Harper family into selling while concealing the true value of their property. Morrison and Whitmore had been monitoring Eli's financial situation, tracking his job search activities, and even investigating Maya's college applications to identify leverage points they could exploit. "Dad," Maya said quietly, "they know everything about us. Our bank account, your job interviews, even my grades and SAT scores. This isn't business. It's stalking." Eli felt a deep anger building in his chest, the kind of rage that came from realizing that people he'd trusted had been systematically betraying him for years. David Whitmore had sat at their dinner table, had offered advice about Maya's future, had expressed sympathy about Catherine's death, all while planning to steal the Harper family's inheritance. But the emails revealed something even more disturbing. Morrison Development's interest in the region wasn't limited to rare earth mining. They were working with foreign investors who wanted to establish a strategic foothold in American mineral production, particularly elements that were essential for military and aerospace applications. The Harper property wasn't just valuable, it was potentially a matter of national security. "We need to take this to the authorities," Eli said. But Maya was already shaking her head. "I tried that," she replied. "But most of this information came from hacked emails and data breaches, which means it might not be admissible in court. And look who Morrison has been working with." She pulled up another document showing Morrison Development's lobbying activities and political donations. The company had been contributing to campaigns and hiring former government officials at both the state and federal level. Their board of advisors included retired military officers, former EPA administrators, and ex-congressional staffers who specialized in mining and environmental regulation. "They're not just rich," Maya explained. "They're connected. If we go to the local authorities, Morrison will know about it before we get back to the car. And if we try to take this to federal agencies, they'll tie us up in bureaucratic procedures for years while they keep pressuring us to sell." Eli studied the evidence his daughter had assembled, impressed by her thoroughness and appalled by what she'd uncovered. The Harper family wasn't just facing a business dispute. They were up against a sophisticated operation with resources and connections that reached far beyond Millbrook County. But Maya's research had also revealed potential allies. Several environmental groups had been investigating Morrison Development's activities, and there were journalists who specialized in exposing corruption in the extractive industries. The company's partnership with foreign investors might violate federal regulations about strategic mineral resources, and their surveillance of the Harper family could constitute harassment or intimidation. "We can't fight them alone," Eli said finally. "But maybe we don't have to." Maya nodded, already thinking several steps ahead. "I've been researching environmental lawyers who specialize in fighting big corporations. And there's this investigative journalist who's been writing about foreign investment in American mining operations. If we can get the right people interested in our story, Morrison's political connections might not be enough to protect them." As dawn broke over the Harper farm, father and daughter sat in the kitchen planning their response to a conspiracy that had been years in the making. The treehouse discovery had revealed more than just a mining claim. It had exposed a web of betrayal and greed that threatened everything the Harper family had worked to preserve. But it had also given them something powerful, the truth. And sometimes, Eli reflected, the truth was the most valuable treasure of all. The next phase of their battle would require careful strategy and trusted allies. Morrison Development and their partners had money, political influence, and insider knowledge. But the Harper family had something their opponents didn't. Expect a 16-year-old genius with a laptop and the moral clarity that came from fighting for something more important than profit. The war for the Harper legacy was about to begin in earnest, and both sides were finally ready to show their true strength. The environmental impact study that Sarah completed over the next 2 weeks became the foundation for everything that followed. Working 18-hour days and calling in favors from colleagues across the country, she assembled a comprehensive analysis of what Morrison Development's mining operation would actually do to the Millbrook region's ecosystem. The results were devastating. "They're not planning selective extraction," Sarah explained during an emergency meeting in the Harper farmhouse kitchen. "Based on the geological surveys I've obtained through FOIA requests, Morrison intends to strip mine nearly 3,000 acres. The environmental damage would be irreversible: contaminated groundwater, destroyed habitats, air pollution that would affect communities for generations." She spread out charts and photographs showing similar mining operations in other parts of the country. The images looked like scenes from an apocalyptic movie: vast pits carved into the earth, poisoned streams running orange with chemical runoff, forests reduced to stumps and bare soil. "This is what they want to do to our land," Maya said, her voice tight with emotion. "And they've been lying about it from the beginning." But Sarah's research had also identified the legal and regulatory vulnerabilities that could stop Morrison's project. The proposed mining operation would require federal environmental permits that hadn't been applied for yet, and the company's foreign investment structure raised questions about compliance with national security regulations governing strategic mineral extraction. "If we can get the right information to the right people at the right time," Sarah explained, "we might be able to trigger federal investigations that would shut down Morrison's operation before it gets started." Maya had been building her own network of allies through social media and online research communities. Environmental activists, investigative journalists, and legal advocacy groups were all interested in the Harper family's story, particularly the evidence of corporate surveillance and political manipulation that Maya had uncovered. "There's a reporter from the Washington Post who specializes in mining industry corruption," Maya reported. "She's been investigating foreign investment in American mineral extraction, and she thinks our case could be exactly the smoking gun she needs for a major expose." But their most important ally turned out to be someone they'd never expected: Tom Henderson, the neighboring farmer who'd recently sold his property to Morrison Development. Henderson appeared at their door on a rainy Thursday evening. his weathered face carrying an expression of shame and determination that Eli recognized from his own darkest moments. The man had clearly been struggling with the decision, and whatever had finally brought him to the Harper farmhouse represented a significant personal cost. "I need to tell you what really happened with my land," Henderson said without preamble, "and why you need to be more careful than you realize." His story revealed the true extent of Morrison's pressure tactics. The development company hadn't just made Henderson a generous offer. They'd systematically destroyed his livelihood until selling was the only option that would allow him to survive financially. First, they bought the grain elevator, where I've been selling my crops for 30 years, Henderson explained. New ownership meant new terms, prices 20% below market rate, take it or leave it. Then my equipment started breaking down all at once, and the only repair shop in the county suddenly couldn't get parts for my machinery. Maya was taking notes, her expression growing darker with each detail. "They sabotaged your farm?" "Nothing I could prove in court," Henderson replied, "but too many coincidences to be random. Equipment failures, supply chain problems, even my bank getting nervous about extending my operating loan. Morrison never had to threaten me directly. They just made it impossible for me to keep farming until selling to them was the only way to avoid bankruptcy." Henderson's revelations explained how Morrison had acquired so many properties in the region despite initial resistance from longtime landowners. The company had perfected a system of economic warfare that destroyed farmers' ability to make a living while maintaining plausible deniability about their tactics. "They're planning the same thing for you," Henderson warned. "I've heard them talking about ways to pressure the Harper family. Your late wife's brother has been providing them with inside information about your financial situation and legal vulnerabilities." But Henderson had more than just warnings to offer. Before selling his property, he documented every suspicious incident and pressure tactic that Morrison had used against him. His records provided evidence of a pattern of harassment and economic manipulation that could support federal charges under racketeering and antitrust laws. "I couldn't fight them alone," Henderson said, "but maybe together we can stop them from doing to other families what they did to me." The next day, Eli and Maya drove to the state capitol to meet with Jennifer Walsh and a team of federal attorneys who specialized in corporate fraud and environmental crimes. The evidence they'd assembled, Maya's research, Sarah's environmental study, Henderson's documentation, and the leaked emails, painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond local business disputes. "This is a RICO case waiting to happen," one of the federal attorneys explained. "Morrison Development's activities constitute organized criminal enterprise, conspiracy, fraud, environmental crimes, and potentially violations of national security laws governing strategic mineral resources. But building a federal case would take time, and Morrison Development wasn't waiting for legal challenges to materialize. Dale Morrison had been escalating his pressure on the Harper family, making increasingly explicit threats about what would happen if they continued to refuse his offers. "Your financial situation is becoming precarious," Morrison had said during his most recent phone call. "Maya's college expenses are going to be substantial, and your unemployment benefits won't last forever. It would be unfortunate if your stubbornness ended up limiting your daughter's opportunities." The veiled threats extended beyond money. Eli had noticed strangers driving slowly past the farmhouse at odd hours, and someone had been accessing their property at night, leaving footprints near the treehouse that suggested surveillance or intimidation activities. Maya's computer had been targeted by sophisticated hacking attempts that were clearly beyond the capabilities of casual criminals. "They're trying to wear us down," Maya observed. "Make us feel isolated and vulnerable until we give up and take whatever they're offering." But the Harper family's resistance was also attracting unexpected support from the local community. Word had spread about Morrison's real intentions for the region, and people who'd been pressured to sell their own properties were beginning to speak up about their experiences. A grassroots coalition was forming, led by farmers and small business owners who understood that Morrison's mining operation would destroy the rural character that defined their way of life. Sarah had emerged as an unofficial spokesperson for the environmental opposition, using her scientific credentials to explain the long-term consequences of rare earth mining to anyone who would listen. Her presentations to church groups, farmer associations, and town council meetings were building public awareness about what was at stake in the battle over the Harper property. "This isn't just about one family's land," Sarah explained during a packed meeting at the local community center. "This is about whether our community has the right to determine its own future, or whether outside corporations can impose their will through money and political pressure." The community meeting had drawn over 200 people, including representatives from environmental groups, farming organizations, and several local political candidates who were running on platforms of protecting rural communities from corporate exploitation. But it had also attracted Dale Morrison and a team of corporate lawyers who'd clearly come to assess the strength of local opposition to their project. Morrison's presentation was polished and professional, emphasizing the economic benefits that mining operations would bring to the region: jobs, tax revenue, infrastructure improvements. But his arguments rang hollow when measured against Sarah's scientific analysis and the testimony of farmers who'd experienced Morrison's pressure tactics firsthand. "In question before this community," Morrison concluded, "is whether you want to embrace economic progress or cling to an unsustainable past. The Harper family's mining claim represents an opportunity for prosperity that won't come again in our lifetimes." When it was Eli's turn to speak, he stood before his neighbors with a clarity of purpose that surprised him. The shy, defeated man who'd retreated to his father's farm just months earlier had been replaced by someone who understood what he was fighting for and why it mattered. "My grandfather hid that mining claim for a reason," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "He knew that some things are more valuable than money, and that protecting the land for future generations requires courage to stand up to people who see only profit where we see home." He looked directly at Dale Morrison as he continued. "The Harper family isn't against development or economic opportunity, but we won't be part of destroying our community to make foreign investors wealthy, while local families lose everything they've worked to build." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, and Eli realized that the battle for the Harper legacy had become something larger, a fight for the soul of a community that refused to be bought or intimidated into submission. But as the meeting ended and people filed out into the crisp autumn evening, Eli knew that Morrison Development wouldn't give up easily. The real confrontation was still ahead, and both sides were preparing for a battle that would determine not just the fate of the Harper property, but the future of everyone who called Millbrook County home. The Millbrook County Town Hall meeting that would decide the Harper family's fate was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in late October, when the autumn leaves had turned the surrounding hills into a tapestry of gold and crimson that reminded everyone what they were fighting to preserve. The meeting had originally been planned as a routine review of Morrison Development's proposed land use permits, but community opposition had transformed it into something closer to a trial. Eli arrived early with Maya and Sarah, carrying a briefcase full of documents that represented months of research and preparation. The evidence they'd assembled was comprehensive: geological surveys, environmental impact analyses, financial records, and testimony from dozens of community members who'd experienced Morrison's pressure tactics firsthand. But they also knew that Dale Morrison would arrive with his own arsenal of legal arguments, political connections, and financial inducements designed to overcome local opposition. The town hall was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the parking lot around speakers that had been hastily installed to accommodate everyone who wanted to witness the proceedings. Eli recognized faces from throughout the community, farmers who'd fought to keep their land, business owners who understood that environmental destruction would devastate the local economy, and young families who wanted to preserve the rural lifestyle that had drawn them to Millbrook County. But Morrison's supporters were also present in significant numbers. Construction workers who'd been promised jobs, local politicians who'd received campaign contributions, and business leaders who believed that economic development trumped environmental concerns had all come to advocate for the mining project. The division in the community was visible in the way people clustered in separate groups, avoiding eye contact with neighbors who'd taken opposing positions in the debate. Maya had insisted on speaking first, and as she approached the podium, Eli felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. His 16-year-old daughter was about to address a room full of adults about issues that would affect generations of residents, and her composure suggested a maturity that still surprised him. "My name is Maya Harper," she began, her voice clear and steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. "6 months ago, I thought this community was the worst place on earth, boring, backward, and completely disconnected from anything that mattered. I was wrong about almost everything." She paused, making eye contact with faces throughout the crowded room. "What I've learned is that some places are worth fighting for, not because they're perfect, but because they represent something important about who we are and what we value. The Harper family's mining claim isn't just about money. It's about whether we have the courage to protect what's precious instead of selling it to the highest bidder." Maya's presentation focused on the environmental science that Sarah had taught her, explaining in accessible terms what rare earth mining would do to the local watershed and wildlife habitat. But she also spoke about community values and the importance of making decisions based on long-term consequences, rather than short-term profits. "Morrison, development wants you to believe that this is about progress versus stagnation," Maya continued. "But real progress means finding ways to prosper without destroying the foundations of our prosperity. If we let them turn our home into an industrial mining site, we'll lose everything that makes this place worth living in." When Maya finished, the applause was sustained and emotional, and Eli realized that his daughter had found her voice in a way that would serve her well regardless of what the future held. Sarah followed with a technical presentation that laid out the environmental consequences of Morrison's proposed mining operation in detail. Her slides showed before and after photographs from similar projects, water quality data from contaminated mining sites, and economic analyses that demonstrated how environmental destruction typically devastated local communities rather than enriching them. "The rare earth elements under the Harper property are valuable," Sarah acknowledged. "But the cost of extracting them, the way Morrison Development proposes, would be far higher than any short-term economic benefits. We're talking about permanent damage to groundwater systems that provide drinking water for thousands of people, and air pollution that would affect respiratory health for generations." But the most powerful testimony came from Tom Henderson and other farmers who'd experienced Morrison's pressure tactics firsthand. Their accounts of economic intimidation and corporate harassment painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond normal business practices. "They didn't just buy my land," Henderson testified. "They destroyed my ability to make a living until selling to them was the only way to survive. That's not free market capitalism, that's extortion." When Dale Morrison finally took the podium, his presentation was everything Eli had expected: polished, professional, and carefully designed to address every argument the opposition had raised. Morrison spoke about job creation, tax revenue, and the economic benefits that would flow from responsible mineral extraction. He presented architectural renderings of the proposed facilities, emphasizing their modern design and environmental safeguards. The Harper family and their supporters want you to believe that economic development and environmental protection are mutually exclusive, Morrison argued. But modern mining technology allows us to extract valuable resources while preserving the landscape and protecting water quality. This project represents the best of both worlds, prosperity and preservation. Morrison's presentation was compelling, and Eli could see that some community members were being swayed by the promises of economic benefits and technological solutions. The battle for public opinion was closer than he'd hoped, and everything would depend on what happened next. The decisive moment came when Maya stood up during the question and answer period and asked Morrison a question that nobody had anticipated. "Mr. Morrison, can you explain why your company has been conducting surveillance on my family's property without our permission?" Morrison's confident demeanor faltered for the first time all evening. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Miss Harper. Morrison Development operates within all applicable laws and regulations." Maya walked to the front of the room, carrying a laptop and a folder thick with printouts. "I have photographs of vehicle license plates registered to Morrison Development, parked on county roads near our property at odd hours. I have documentation of attempted hacking attacks on our computer systems that were traced back to IP addresses associated with your company. And I have copies of emails between you and David Whitmore discussing ways to pressure my family into selling our property." The room fell silent as Maya connected her laptop to the projection system and began displaying evidence that she'd been compiling for weeks. The photographs of surveillance vehicles were time-stamped and geolocated. The cybersecurity reports were provided by professional firms that had investigated the hacking attempts. And the emails obtained through the data breach that Maya had discovered months earlier laid out Morrison's strategy in damning detail. These emails show that Morrison Development has been monitoring our financial situation, investigating our personal relationships, and coordinating with my uncle David to pressure us into selling at below-market prices, Maya explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done her homework. "This isn't business. This is harassment." Dale Morrison was visibly struggling to maintain his composure as the evidence mounted. "Miss Harper, I think you're misinterpreting some routine business communications." "Really?" Maya interrupted, clicking to the next slide. "Because this email from you to David Whitmore talks about accelerating pressure and making us an offer we can't refuse before they get smart enough to consult an independent geologist. That doesn't sound like routine business to me." The crowd was murmuring with increasing agitation as the scope of Morrison's deception became clear. Even some of his supporters looked uncomfortable with the evidence of surveillance and manipulation that Maya was presenting. But Maya wasn't finished. Her final revelation was the document that changed everything. A copy of the Harper family Bible that had been in the treehouse alongside the mining claim documents, but which they'd only recently examined in detail. This family Bible contains a deed amendment that my great-grandfather filed in 1924, Maya announced, projecting an image of the handwritten document onto the screen. It transfers the Harper mining claim into a conservation trust that protects the land from commercial development while allowing the family to retain mineral rights for educational and scientific purposes only. The gasps from the audience were audible as people realized what this meant. The Harper mining claim couldn't be sold to Morrison Development or any other commercial entity because it had been legally protected for nearly a century. My great-grandfather knew that people would try to pressure future generations into selling the land for commercial mining, Maya continued. So he created a legal structure that makes it impossible. The mineral rights can never be transferred to a for-profit company, and any development must be limited to scientific research and environmental education. Morrison was on his feet now, his professional composure completely abandoned. That document would need to be verified by the court. There's no guarantee that a deed amendment from 1924 would be enforceable under current law. Actually, said a voice from the back of the room, it would be enforceable, and we've already verified its authenticity. All eyes turned to see Jennifer Walsh entering the town hall with two men in dark suits who clearly weren't local residents. Walsh had been working with federal authorities for weeks, But she'd never mentioned that FBI agents would be attending the town meeting. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Rodriguez are here to investigate allegations of racketeering, conspiracy, and violations of environmental protection laws, Walsh announced. Based on evidence provided by the Harper family and other community members, Morrison Development is now under federal investigation for criminal activities related to their land acquisition program. The mood in the room shifted dramatically as people realized that the evening's proceedings had taken on legal implications that went far beyond local politics. Morrison was already moving toward the exit, followed by his team of lawyers and corporate representatives. But the FBI agents intercepted them before they could leave. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Miller said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of federal law enforcement. "We'd like to speak with you about your business practices in this region. We have some questions about the surveillance activities and pressure tactics that have been documented by multiple witnesses." As Morrison and his associates were escorted from the building, the remaining crowd erupted in discussion. Some people were celebrating the apparent victory over corporate intimidation, while others were processing the implications of everything they'd witnessed. Eli found himself surrounded by neighbors offering congratulations and support, but his attention was focused on Maya, who was carefully packing up her laptop and research materials with the methodical precision of someone who'd just completed the most important presentation of her life. "How long have you known about the Conservation Trust?" he asked when he finally reached her side. Maya smiled with a combination of exhaustion and triumph. "I found it 3 days ago, but I wanted to wait until the right moment to use it. Great-grandfather was smarter than anyone realized. He didn't just hide the mining claim, he protected it in a way that would preserve the land forever." 6 months after the town hall meeting that exposed Morrison Development's criminal activities, Eli Harper stood in the restored treehouse watching his daughter teach a group of visiting geology students about sustainable mineral extraction and environmental stewardship. The structure that had once been mocked as a symbol of failure had been transformed into an outdoor classroom where Maya conducted educational programs about the intersection of natural resources and community values. The restoration project had taken most of the winter, but it had been worth every hour of careful work. The treehouse now featured weatherproof walls, solar-powered lighting, and display cases containing samples of the rare earth minerals that lay beneath the Harper property. More importantly, it had become a symbol of what was possible when communities chose preservation over profit and long-term thinking over short-term gain. Maya had deferred her college admission for a year to help establish the Harper Conservation Trust as a working model for sustainable land management. The trust generated income through educational programs, research partnerships with universities, and carefully controlled mineral sampling that provided specimens for scientific study without environmental damage. It wasn't the fortune that Morrison Development had offered, but it was enough to support the family while preserving the land for future generations. The legal aftermath of Morrison's exposure had been swift and comprehensive. Dale Morrison and 3 of his associates were facing federal charges for racketeering, environmental crimes, and conspiracy. David Whitmore had been disbarred and was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The foreign investors backing Morrison Development had quietly withdrawn from the project, leaving behind a network of purchased properties that were being sold to local families at fair market prices. Tom Henderson had been among the first to buy back his family's land, using compensation from a class action lawsuit against Morrison Development. The community coalition that had formed to fight the mining project had evolved into a regional advocacy group focused on protecting rural communities from corporate exploitation. Sarah Chen had been elected to the county commission on a platform of sustainable development and environmental protection. But the most significant change was in Maya herself. The shy, resentful teenager who'd been dragged to the farm against her will had grown into a confident young woman with a clear sense of purpose. Her work with the Conservation Trust had earned her early admission to Northwestern's Environmental Science program, where she planned to study sustainable resource management, with the goal of returning to Millbrook County as a professional advocate for rural communities. The students were impressed with your presentation today, Eli told her, as they walked back toward the farmhouse together. Dr. Williams from the State University said you have a natural gift for explaining complex scientific concepts in ways that people can understand. Maya smiled, but her expression carried the thoughtful quality that had replaced her earlier anger and frustration. I've been thinking about great-grandfather's letters, and how he knew that protecting the land would require each generation to make different choices based on changing circumstances. He couldn't develop the mining claim in the 1920s because he didn't have the political support or legal protection he needed. But we were able to preserve it because we had allies and laws that didn't exist in his time. They paused at the edge of the oak tree's massive canopy, looking up at the restored treehouse where several solar panels gleamed in the late afternoon sun. The structure had become a landmark visible from the county road, and visitors often stopped to photograph the unusual sight of a thoroughly modern educational facility built into the branches of an ancient tree. "Do you ever regret not taking Morrison's money?" Eli asked. $15 million would have solved a lot of problems. Maya considered the question seriously before answering. "I think about it sometimes, especially when I'm doing homework by candlelight because the power went out again. But then I remember what this place looked like in Morrison's architectural renderings, all glass and steel and artificial landscaping designed to hide the fact that they'd basically turned our home into an industrial site." She gestured toward the view from the treehouse, which encompassed rolling hills, the clear running creek, and pastures where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. This is what great-grandfather was trying to protect. Not just the land itself, but the idea that some things are more valuable than money, and that taking care of the earth is more important than extracting profit from it. Eli nodded, understanding that his daughter had learned lessons about value and responsibility that would serve her well, regardless of what challenges lay ahead. The Conservation Trust would provide enough income to support Maya's education and maintain the property, but more importantly, it had given both of them a sense of purpose that connected them to something larger than their individual circumstances. The farmhouse kitchen where they prepared dinner that evening was warm with the kind of contentment that comes from work well done and battles honorably fought. Sarah joined them for the meal, as she had most evenings since their friendship had deepened into something that looked increasingly like love. She'd brought fresh vegetables from her own garden and news about the latest developments in the ongoing federal investigation of Morrison Development. The prosecutors think they'll be able to recover most of the money that Morrison stole from local families through fraud and intimidation, Sarah reported. Tom Henderson should get full compensation for his losses, and there's talk about establishing a victim compensation fund for everyone who was pressured into selling their property at below market prices. As they sat around the kitchen table sharing stories about their day, Eli reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that stormy night when Maya discovered the hidden lockbox in the treehouse. The financial security they'd found wasn't the kind that came from stock portfolios or corporate salaries, but rather the deeper satisfaction of building something meaningful that would outlast their individual lifetimes. Maya was already making plans for expanding the Conservation Trust's educational programs, partnering with regional schools to bring environmental science education to students who might never otherwise have access to hands-on learning about geology and ecology. Her vision for the future included research facilities that would attract scientists from around the world, turning the Harper property into a center for sustainable resource management that could serve as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Great-grandfather would be proud, Eli said. watching his daughter sketch out plans for the trust's next phase of development. He protected the land so that future generations would have the freedom to make choices based on wisdom rather than desperation. You're proving that his faith was justified. The restored treehouse stood silhouetted against the evening sky as darkness settled over the Harper farm, its solar-powered lights creating a gentle glow that was visible for miles. What had once been dismissed as worthless had become a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that communities could choose their own destinies if they had the courage to stand up for their values. The Harper family's story had become something larger than their individual triumph, a reminder that some battles are worth fighting not because victory is certain, but because the alternative is surrendering everything that makes life meaningful. And in the treehouse that had kept its secrets for nearly a century, Maya Harper was already teaching the next generation that the most valuable treasures are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone wise enough to recognize their true worth.